Hey everyone, I'm Michael and welcome to another video. I'd like to show you guys a little trick that I have kind of picked up over the past few months working on Restitched and Socially Distant, to do with constructors in C# and dealing with getting a lot of object references into a single object. What I mean by that is I've set up this little program here. It's not an actual game, but it's just a little demo of a common thing that games will tend to do, and that is initializing a player. And what that means is taking all of the different parts of a player and setting them all up and bringing them together into a single player object. There are many ways you can do this, but typically in C# and Unity, it means creating a whole bunch of player-related objects and user interfaces and stuff like that, and bringing it all together into one single player instance, and then you can share that instance around to represent that player. And that's what I've set up here. I've set up a little program that creates a whole bunch of stuff, some sort of dummy classes for like user interfaces. We got some inventory stuff, we have some heads-up display stuff, mini-map, phone, all that wonderful stuff. We have some gameplay systems like a weapon manager, the character itself, you know, basic player stuff that you might see in a player character in code. And then right below here, what we go ahead and do is we wrap this all up into a single player object, passing all of the data into the player object's constructor. And then the player itself, it's pretty simple. We have a bunch of private read-only fields for the different parts of this player. Doesn't have to be that way. You can do auto properties, you can do public fields, you can do whatever you feel like doing, but this is just my way of doing it. I like to be very explicit about things. And then, of course, what I do is, because I really don't want anyone modifying the read-only data, I go ahead and create public properties to expose all of those variables. And then down here we have the constructor, which has all of the parameters for each thing that makes up this player, and it just goes ahead and brings it all into the private fields. Pretty simple. But this is not a great way of doing this. It'll work fine if you don't have many things you have to bring into the player object, and I was doing this sort of way of doing things in Socially Distant for a little while, but it does become a little bit hard to manage at times, and later on in development as you start adding new things to your player. For example, let's say that I needed to add a waypoint system as part of my... Actually, no, I'm not going to do that because that could be added to the minimap. But let's say that I needed some sort of mission log type thing to go along with my player. You know, every time I complete a mission, it goes into the mission log, right? Well, here's what it would take to add that. First of all, I would need to add my mission log class. Alright? Pretty simple. You know, eventually I'd move this over to its own file, but then I need to add its private read-only field. Now I need to expose the property. Alright, pretty simple. But now I need to go ahead and add it to my constructor. Okay, that was a little bit less simple because I had to add that comma there, and now I need to go ahead and add the mission log to the... or I need to take the mission log from the constructor argument and pass it into the variable. You know, that's done with, but we're not done yet because we need to go tab back here, and remember we're initializing a player here, and now this is all gone red because we're missing a parameter. So now I need to actually instantiate that mission log. Alright, you know, pretty simple. And then now I need to add it to the constructor here, pass it along, and you know, that's done. That's about 5 or 6 steps, give or take. And you know, we go back here and we move mission log into its own file. Give me a moment here. I'm visually impaired, so I need to zoom in and do this. I managed to do most of that without zooming in. Alright, so it's moved into its own file. Great. Now there is a problem here, because I'm one person, and I added that class, I added it to the player, and I instantiated it. It's all fine. It's not too long for me to do, right? But it doesn't scale well, because let's say you have multiple players that need to be initialized. Like, let's say that we have a 4-player game, and someone just plugs in a controller. Now that new player has to spawn in. I don't know why I said 4-player specifically, but you get the point. Now we've made this a multiplayer game. Alright. Now, of course, player 2 is using the exact same systems as player 1, the exact same instances of those systems, and that's not ideal. So we'll want to go ahead and take all of this code over here, excluding the actual variable declaration, and go ahead and copy it. And I'm doing a little bit of a trick here that you shouldn't really do, but for demonstration purposes this is fine. I'm taking the old data and overwriting it with new data. And, you know, there we go. That creates a second player. Now, note that I actually had to go ahead and create whole new instances for each of the parts of the new player, because it's a new player. Now, you would wrap this in a function, but still, this is to demonstrate having to initialize a player from multiple places in the code. And if you need to add a new object to the player, and then you need to add something new to the constructor, now you have to go and update every use of that constructor, and that's not great. Now, one can argue that you should structure your code in such a way where that's not necessary, but we can do better. We can do better than this. So, how do we do better? Well, we actually change the way our constructor works. Because one of the other problems with this is you could forget the order of which argument goes where. For example, I might screw this up and pass my phone before I pass my minimap, and now it just doesn't work. That's not great. Order matters here. But we can structure this in a way where order doesn't matter. So first of all, let's start by getting rid of player 2. Done. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to introduce a new type into this whole ordeal here. See how we have all of these private read-only fields? We're actually going to get rid of them all soon. But we're going to keep the properties. But what we're also going to do is we're going to create a new structure. Public struct player data. And inside of this structure, we're going to take all of those these private fields here. Whoops, hang on. Now we're going to just get them out of the code. They're gone. We don't have to worry about them anymore. And we're going to replace those private fields with another one, private player data. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take those private fields that are still in our clipboard, and we're going to paste them into the player data structure. And move it into its own file. Now, the next thing that we need to actually go ahead and do is zoom in here, and I'm going to create a bunch of cursors because we need to make these public and not read-only. Okay, done. Now, from here, we have a whole bunch of missing stuff. So, we'll start with the constructor. It's pretty simple. We just need to take away all of these arguments and replace them with a single player data. And from here, we move the player data from the constructor into the field. Like so. Now to deal with the properties, it's quite simple. We can actually do them all in batches, or in a batch, I should say. And what we're going to do is we're going to cursor over until after the word this, and replace this with player data. So now it just pulls all of those references from the player data. Okay. Now we're not done yet, because, well, we have dramatically simplified our player right now. What we've done is we've moved all of those constructor arguments into a structure. And that allows us to freely add new data to the structure without having to update any uses of the constructor. The only thing that needs to happen is we will need to add a new public property here to expose the data. And we'll also need to go anywhere where we're initializing a player, which is, if it's done right, should only be once in the code. And, you know, we have to do a few things right here. The first thing that we need to do is all of these variable declarations here should not be here. They should not be declaring variables. They should be setting variables on a brand new player data structure. Alright, so we're going to take all of these vars and replace them with player data dot, like so. So this creates all of our player data and, you know, adds all of our objects into this one little structure that we can pass around. And then all we need to do is pass it into the player constructor. Alright, so that's pretty simple. Now let's try adding something new. In the spirit of Restitched, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to pretend that we're making Stuffy, except he has a weapon and a phone and a minimap and all that wonderful stuff. So Stuffy, naturally, he has a craft book. So let's give him a little craft book here. We're going to start by creating a craft book class. Alright. Now we need to get this all into the player. So, first of all, we go into player data. Actually, first of all, because I'm anal about this, we're going to go ahead and move craft book into its own class. Alright. Where is it? Move to craftbook.cs. There we go. Okay, so craftbook.cs is there. We're going to go into player data. And all we need to do is add a little public craftbook. So that's step 2. Step 3 is exposing it through a property. And step 4 is wherever we are initializing a player, we obviously need to give that player a new craft book. Right. Whoops, that was... okay, occasionally Writer's code completion does that. That's weird. Anyway, so that's step 4. And everything else is done for us. So, what have we learned through this? First of all, or what have we saved? First of all, we've saved like 2 or 3 steps because we no longer needed to update that constructor, but we've also gained the ability to not have to worry about the order in which we pass things through. Because we're only passing one thing into a constructor, the rest is going into a struct, which means that if the craft book, for whatever reason, depends on something else, you know, that other thing can be initialized first. Or if something else depends on craft book, we can just move craft book into another little line of code here, and it'll work the exact same. It'll get to the exact same place regardless, which is pretty handy. The other thing that we have actually learned accidentally, if you're not as familiar with JetBrains Writer or IDEs as I am, is we've actually learned how to batch edit things and you know, take a whole bunch of code that's very repetitive and edit it all at once. For example, and how you do that, by the way, I don't know why I said for example, but how you do that, by the way, is you go ahead and hit Control, you tap it really quickly, and then you hold it after releasing it. And then if you wait too long, you'll end up in the screen scrolling mode, but that's because I didn't do it right. But what you do is you tap Control, you quickly release it, press it down again, and then quickly right afterward you press the up or down arrow key. And you'll notice that we have created another cursor. And you can keep going down until you've created as many cursors as you need. If you need to, or if you've created too many, you just go in the opposite direction and it will delete the previous cursor. And then you can go ahead and edit things just like it's a normal line of text. So that's interesting for any of you guys who are new to that. So that's an interesting trick. But really the interesting part of this is the ability for us to create a player, have a whole bunch of stuff attached to this player. One could say player stuff. And, you know, that was kind of a stuffy joke there. But, you know, create a whole bunch of player data, and pass it into a player instance that we can then pass around. Now, there is one thing that I do need to explain, and it's why did I create a struct instead of a class? Because, you know, this is a struct, which means that if I'm passing this around, it's making a copy of all of these references. And the reason for that is actually to do with networking and multiplayer. What we don't want is this data being muffled around with while it's in transit. So by creating copies of it, you cannot actually mutate the original player data that was passed around, which is important. But the player instance that we create that wraps this whole thing up can modify its player data because it holds it in its own memory. And therefore, only the actual player that owns this data can modify this data, and that is why it's a struct. It will create copies when you pass it around, but ideally you are not passing this around directly, you're passing the player instance around. So that's a little bit of a safety measure there. Now, that is basically about it. It's not a very elaborate game that I put together here. It doesn't actually do anything if I run this. It's a freaking class library. What did you expect it to do? But I wanted to show you guys how to really cut down on your constructors and not having to deal with positional arguments and stuff like that in C#. It's very annoying when you have like 8 or more things being passed into a constructor, and then you have to manage all of that, and then God forbid you add something or remove something or move something, so this should definitely help out. It also works for functions as well. If you need to pass around a whole bunch of data, you can pass around an object instead of just a bunch of data, and it'll work. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Before I end this video off, though, I want to say that I have started a Patreon. I know that I'm a little bit small, but it would really mean a lot to me if you guys checked it out, and I'll have a link in the description. Thanks so much to Potato Farm, the first ever Patreon ever for me, for supporting me as a programmer and enjoying what I do enough to buy me a cup of coffee. Anyway, with that said, as always, I've been Michael, lead programmer of Restitched at Trixel Creative, and Socially Distant, my own game. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.